Welcome to Doctors at Work. My name's Matt Daniel, and this podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. Today's topic is fellowships. Now, you're coming towards the end of your training. Are you ready to become a consultant, or do you need to do something else? For many people, end of training means getting ready to enter the workforce as a consultant. But for some people, they want to do a fellowship. And there are lots and lots of different reasons why you might want to do a fellowship. And of course, there are lots of different types of fellowships also. In this episode of Doctors at Work, Simon Fleming tells me about the different types of fellowships, what it all means, and how you can actually obtain a fellowship. The bottom line is that it's a very personal decision. Different people want different things from fellowships, and that means that it's impossible to be prescriptive about what one should do. The key thing is to really understand what it is that you want out of a fellowship, and also to make sure that you plan early. Welcome, Simon. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
My name's Simon Fleming. I'm a consultant orthopedic hand and wrist surgeon, currently working in Australia. But I trained in the United Kingdom over many years, and when I'm not just finishing my fellowship and starting my consultant life, I've got a PhD in medical education, and I do a lot of work in the kind of workplace culture space as well. So reasonably busy.
And today's topic for us is fellowships. So tell me a little bit about your fellowship.
So, as an orthopedic surgeon, there are, as you may or may not know, loads of little subspecialty areas, and my area of expertise, if you like, is hand and wrist surgery. So I undertook a 1 year fellowship in hand and wrist surgery in Sydney, and then just recently finished a much shorter kind of visiting clinical uh, fellowship in Toronto, which was only a couple of weeks and was far more observing than it was doing things. But I guess we'll get into that and the pros and cons of that because there are certainly different types of fellowship out there.
Maybe if we kind of start in the beginning. So there you are. You're coming to the end of your training. You're going to get your CCT. What made you decide that you needed to do any more training? Why not just take CCT and leave it at that?
So it's the kind of elephant in the room, I guess, is that it varies by specialty. So, it's interesting that you say, oh, you're coming to the end of your training. In certain specialties, and for certain fellowships, you actually have to plan far in advance. And I'm talking years. So if you look at some of the more competitive specialties, in terms of their fellowships, um, there may be anywhere from a 2 to 3 year lead as to when they appoint. So, pre before I was able to get my time out to do my PhD, I was due to do my fellowship in 2019, 2020, and I applied for the fellowship in 2016, 17. Um, and so I guess the first thing to say is depending on what your major specialty is, whether it's surgery or medicine or anesthetics or critical care or whatever, you have to be aware that some of the more competitive fellowships, both national and international, um, might need you to apply years and years in advance. Um, the second thing is just the sheer fact of the matter, which is that again, for certain specialties, you will not get a consultant appointment without fellowship training. Now, some people do see this as a criticism of training, that you need more training. Um, and I guess again, it depends what you perceive fellowship as and what you perceive your fellowship as offering. Um, for some people, it's a finishing school. It's about finessing either technical or non-technical, clinical or non-clinical skills, such that you're just a little bit more ready to take on that consultant role, especially in say a niche subspecialty. So, for example, in hand and wrist surgery, um, sure you might do 6 or 12 months of it during your training. I did 18, nearly 24 months of it during my training. But there is an argument for doing nothing but that for 6 to 12 months and being able to ask those more complicated questions. For other specialties, it's not just about a finishing school, but it's about exposure to things that you just may not have seen during your training, which is the nature of training ever in the world. And I'm lucky enough to have seen it in the UK, Canada, and Australia. If you want to do something that is pretty uncommon or pretty niche, or something that is uncommon in most workplaces, but to get good at it, you need to see it very often. So, you know, what's a nice example? In the hospital I just left, my fellowship base, if you like, we had two difficult airway fellows, and they, fair enough, did mostly general anesthesia, but they would be pulled from one operating list to another operating list if there was a difficult airway, and they were on the difficult airway team. So, whereas your day-to-day jobbing anaesthetist may deal with the odd difficult airway now and then, they spent a year doing nothing but. Similarly, we had two block fellows who did nothing but complicated blocks. They really didn't do general anesthetics and things. They did now on the weekends when they were on call, but their Monday to Friday was nothing but getting really, really good at blocks. And you can see where it adds that value. Uh, so I was quite far pre-CCT when I knew that I wanted to be a hand and wrist surgeon. I recognized that I wanted to spend a minimum of a year doing my subspecialty interest and not just doing it every day, but being in an environment where you're pushed a little bit, where you see things that you don't see very often, where you have an increased level of autonomy, and where there is a psychological safe space to make mistakes. Because of course the difference between a one of the many differences between being a trainee and or being in some sort of training learning environment and being in a more formalized, say, consultant or SAS grade environment is um, the you will make mistakes and the buck stops with you. And what you want is to be in a space where you can take on the more complicated things, push yourselves out of your comfort zone, but be in an environment where you are taught and mentored and supported when those inevitable mistakes are made. I was told um, in your fellowship, if you're not being humbled at least once or twice a week, you're not doing it right. And yeah, I was humbled at least once or twice a week. Um, but that's kind of what you want. That's kind of what you're looking for. And so yeah, I pre-CCT was looking for that. I was looking for somewhere, and and this gets into kind of the kind of different types of fellowship out there, broadly speaking. Um, I'm obviously going to speak through a surgical lens. However, they apply to kind of everything. So the first type of fellowship is extremely prestigious, right? World famous. Everyone's heard of the unit. Everyone's heard of all the people who work there. They're all very, very, very famous. But you don't get to do much. But it does go on your CV. And so it opens doors in the consultant job hunt world, and it creates networks for you going forward. Um, the second type of fellowship is the one that really doesn't have much of a reputation, on the international scene, for example, but everyone knows that you just fill your boots there. Whatever it is you might do, whatever it is your interest is, whether it's surgical or critical care or medical or whatever, everyone just knows that it's a good place to go. They do a lot of whatever it might be. Um, but no one's heard of it, but it'll look good for a logbook. It'll look good when you're talking to your consultant colleagues and you go, "Oh, I've done 45 of those." And they go, "Well, I've only seen three. Bloody hell." And then the final one is the unicorn. That's the prestigious, famous, big name where you get to do a lot of what you want to do. And actually, it's a really personal choice as to what you're looking for. And you have to reflect quite sensibly on, do I want to go somewhere because I need to learn how to do something, my specialty, my area of interest, whatever it might be? Do I want to actually build a lot of networks, go to a lot of conferences, meet a lot of people. Why am I going there? And so when I was looking around at fellowships, I really wanted a unicorn. I wanted one that had a good reputation for helping me to do my day-to-day job, but I also wanted to have one of those fellowships that the moment you say, certainly in the surgical circles, I did my fellowship here, um, people would go, oh, right. And it's unashamedly part of the certainly the surgical culture is that that is a facet, is that certain fellowships have those reputations. Now on top of that, there are all the other factors about why you choose a fellowship. So I wanted to go international, and I wanted that because I wanted a bit of a break. I wanted to go somewhere I'd not lived and worked. I wanted an adventure. Um, and that decision comes with a, a million different facets, including time and privilege and money and your situation at home. And um, that has to factor into your fellowship plans. What is your home situation? If there are people at home with you, are they coming with you? Are they traveling? Are they able to travel? What does the accommodation options look like where you may or may not go? And that might be the other side of the world, or it might be just up the motorway. Are they moving? Um, are they going to work? Are they going to go to school? Do you need support networks, whether that's family, friends, childcare, schools? So, so on top of me knowing what I wanted also had to fit in with what I needed for my life and for my own mental health and for my own relationships. And so part of it was choosing a fellowship that I knew was in a place that was relatively family friendly because I have a wife and a young child, that I knew had um, logistics that would mean I'd be able to get my paperwork signed off and actually be able to work there. Um, things like, and I'm sure we can get into it at some stage or another, but things like finances. Not all fellowships are particularly well paid. So there is a spectrum of fellowships in the world, from unpaid fellowships, which I think are fundamentally wrong, but they still exist out there. And again, they are often structured around one of those types of fellowships where they're a famous unit, and so they know they will find people who, through whatever means, whether it's political, personal, or whatever, have the money to spend 3 months, 6 months, a year in a space unsalaried, unpaid. There are some fellowships that come with small stipends. Not quite enough to live in that city, but enough that you're not going to starve. And then you often have to top those up with locums or grants and bursaries, which you might have applied for, or again, other sources of funds. You get some that are kind of funded from bits here and bits there and bits of the other. And so it is livable, but you have to work pretty hard to make ends meet. You get some fellowships that have very niche setups. So I know of one fellowship where you were paid virtually nothing, but you got free accommodation for the year, bills included.
Okay.
So, so though your salary on paper looked bonkers, you didn't have to worry about rental bills. Um, uh, and then there are other fellowships where you are paid, either at the level of a registrar or a senior registrar or something. Again, often with the opportunity to top it up through other means, but not always. So when I picked, it's interesting actually when I picked my fellowship in 2016, it had a reputation for being quite poorly paid, and I had to make some really hard choices about, you know. for 12 months, am I okay just living extremely frugally? Like really, really frugally. But as a resident doctor in the United Kingdom, I was like, I've done it before, I can do it again. Um, I can make this work. And then actually, through more luck than judgment, the salary structure in the fellowship shifted, and I was actually reasonably well remunerated for my year on fellowship, which was a pleasant surprise. I really was. It's funny. And I guess part of choosing a fellowship, there's this a bit like Fight Club. There's the first rule of fellowships is you'll never really hear anyone badmouth their fellowship, not publicly anyway. Um, and so I would advise you to speak to people who've done fellowships before, in particular in your area, and get their advice, and ideally get their advice kind of off the record, if you like. And they'll tell you the pros and cons, the real ups and downs of that particular space. And this fellowship, the one I did, had was everyone just sung its praises, and I knew very senior consultants and some very fresh off the top post-CCT people who'd done it, and they all kind of said similar things. And I was like, this is reassuring. And I spoke to one of their immediate past fellows, and I said, "Man, how do you live? How do you live on that salary?" And he was like, "It's really good." And I was like, "No, it's not. I applied for this, and and he was like, "No, the last 2 years they've changed it. It's actually not terrible. Like you're earning money that means you can live in a flat and pay your bills and buy food and all the rest." Um, and so it's such a multifaceted, multifactorial decision you have to make about what you want from your fellowship, where you want to go, how long for. Um, are you going because you need technical skills? You want to be doing things because then you need to be doing things? Or are you going because, for example, you want to observe some things and look at some systems things? As I alluded to, I recently did something like that in Toronto, where there's a unit that has started doing some really cool stuff kind of in clinics. And I wanted to see what that looked like. So I arranged an observing fellowship, which is actually quite common in surgery. There are some really prestigious fellowships in surgery where you're not allowed to operate, where it's about following and shadowing and looking over people's shoulders and taking notes and seeing how they do what they do and how they run their system. But actually, it's not about you doing the procedure. It is assumed you can already do the things they do, basically. And so again, it's a bit like watching a chef at work. You're there to really pick up the little subtle, clever little things they do, not learn how to chop an onion, you know. And so it's such a personal choice about every facet of it, really, about where you go, about why you're going, about how long you're going to go for, about who's going with you, if anyone. Um, and all those things have to come together to make a good fellowship. Um, and that's why there's no one recipe card for it, because there are some people who are like, I don't need a fellowship. In my specialty, and in my world, and in what I want to be for the next 20, 30, 40 years, I don't need it. My ST6 or my ST7 or my ST8 or whatever it was just what I need. I'm ready to go. Um, and there are other times where that's just not an option.
I hope you're enjoying the show. Please click subscribe so you'll be notified when new episodes become available. This podcast is part of my mission to help doctors create successful and meaningful careers. You can be part of that mission too by forwarding this show to one person who you think might benefit from listening. Thank you. Now on with the show. I think it strikes me as quite a difficult decision, not least of which is the fact that you have to make it early. Because, if we are talking about some of those fellowships that the international ones that will recruit 2 or 3 years in advance, that means that you have to know 2 or 3 years in
Yeah,
advance and be
yeah.
ready. And yes, there are some people that know very early what they want to do, but there are lots and lots of people that basically, I mean, they're going to be what, halfway through their training, they won't even have done their exit exams, and they're having to decide which subspecialty they want to do, and presumably also thinking, is there going to be a job? So if I do this subspecialty, but then this, where's the job at the end of that?
And
We're not talked about
and
that aspect. And then there's
and the
all,
really competitive ones, it doesn't mean you're going to get the fellowship. So
yeah,
you can't just you often have to have a plan B and C and D, as well as having a plan. Is there a job at the end of it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So how do you actually find out what fellowships exist out there?
So there's a bit like anything really. There's a multitude of different ways. There is the grapevine. There's that kind of intangible, everyone knows thing, which is you speak to your consultant colleagues and the more senior trainees, and you say, "Well, where do people go on fellowship? Where's good?" And they'll tell you.
Mm,
Um, what you will find is that your specialty, whatever it may be, will likely have a list somewhere on the internet of fellowships. Normally ones that are accredited in some way through some kind of organization. So the BSSH, the British Society of Surgery of the Hand, the British Orthopaedic Association, the British Orthopaedic Training Association, all have lists of fellowships that are good and accredited and recognized by both those organizations, the UK organizations, and often the key is they're also accredited by their own country's organizations. So my Australian fellowship was also accredited by the Australian Orthopaedic Association and the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons. So there are nearly always lists somewhere, normally associated either with your college or your specialty organization. Um, but for me, the best source of information was my trainee organization. So for me, it was BOTA, but there are others. And word of mouth. There's there's something about combining all those facts because again, remembering that word of mouth is all well of good, but no one ever badmouths their fellowship. So I took the word of mouth stuff and then I basically fact checked it. But the fellowship I did was not the only fellowship I explored or applied for. It was the one I did. And so you have to do your homework early. And part of doing your homework early, even if you just do your homework early, is, as you say, because you're doing it early in your training, it allows for life to happen. So, it allows for changes in your family circumstance or relationship circumstance. It allows for you to maybe not have a great time at the exam. It allows for you to know where you can reach out to, who you can reach out to, what the other options are, so that if you need to change tack, change direction, change plan, you don't go, well, I only knew about this one and I only applied for this one, and now what? So my CCT date was delayed because of COVID, for example, and it allowed me to reach out to both the fellowship I did and a couple of the other fellowships I was looking into and go, what what does this look like? Because I'm not going to be leaving the country when I thought I was leaving the country. Um, so again, a big part of it is just doing some relatively low stress homework early, so that when the time comes to pull the trigger, you have all that at your fingertips, and you know where's good, where's got spaces, but also it means you know where to watch in case something comes up short notice, if that's the space that you're in.
One of the things that I also think is interesting when you're looking around is that, as you say, everybody will always speak well of the fellowship, but there's something about what people are not saying. So it's kind of, it's listening. Okay, there's all of this good stuff. What have they not said? And I suppose the other thing also is where people end up. Where the fellows end up, because I think that tells you something about, I mean, both the prestige and the skill, and the two things are not the same, yeah. But the where people go from a fellowship, where people become in a substantive, that tells you, how prestigious is it and what kind of skills have developed or not, as the case may be. I'm interested in, okay, so there you are, you know where to go, but what do? You email people there, and people say, they react, say, who's this person? Why you email me? Or how do you get to meet them? What do you ask? How do they react?
Again, it depends on your personality and your networks. So, yeah, so for me, I did a mixture of all of those things. So I sent some emails, I arranged some visits, and used it as an excuse to take a holiday. So most of the fellowships I was interested in, the international ones were in Australia, and the ones in the UK that I was interested in, there was one in the Midlands, there was one somewhere else, and I arranged visits. I and it's one of the best things I did because it actually allowed me to get a real sense of the place and actually allowed them to get a sense of me. Now, uh, I made the choice to do that. You don't have to. My fellow on my fellowship hadn't done that. Um, I, I did it because I wanted to and because it was as no, a good as an excuse as any to take a holiday. You really don't have to, but I would advise reaching out, not just to previous fellows, but to the unit. And often what the unit will do, of course, is go, yeah, like you say, who are you? And what they'll often do is put you in touch with the current fellows, which is actually what you want.
Yeah.
Because much as it's all well and good meeting the bosses and that is kind of always nice to give them a nod, you want people who are in the post right now to tell you what it's like right now. What was their interview like? What's the job like? How are they paying the bills? What's the weather like? What's the commute like? What's like all that stuff. Um, and so yeah, I would reach out and whether you're an email person or a phone call person or a social media person, just reach out and take an opportunity to see what they have to say, and you'll you'll be in a better position because you'll just be slightly better informed. Like there are people who apply cold, and those people are sometimes successful, but I would just advise I wouldn't do that. I personally would get a little bit more information under my belt and get a real sense of the place, the culture, the general vibe.
It's also difficult to know when jobs are actually out to advert, because unless you have contact with the people, you won't know,
Well,
because
exactly, and often it's not clear when they're going to advertise or if they advertise. A lot of these fellowships don't advertise. It's just a thing where you contact them and they go, please fill in this form. Now you will see adverts on Twitter and LinkedIn for fellowships, and you see them on, Indeed and all these other kind of job websites. But there are a lot of fellowships that don't specifically advertise their jobs. They just have rounds of application that you need to somehow know about. So again, you will find all that out the moment you reach out to either a current or recent fellow or that unit, and they'll go, "Oh yeah, actually, they interview every November, so you just have to make sure you've filled out the form before then." And you're like, "Oh, well, now I know."
and you won't know that kind of data unless you've actually reached out. Because if you say,
Yeah,
I want to work in such and such a hospital, I'll wait for them to advertise, then you've no idea where they will advertise, if they'll advertise.
yeah,
So
no, absolutely.
I mean, how do you actually get one? So, you did an international fellowship, so that means that every orthopedic surgeon in the world potentially would be looking at exactly the same job that you went for and got. So I'm thinking, wow, what are the odds of actually succeeding? So what does it take to actually get a fellowship?
And this is the same as how do you get a job? Some of it's right place, right time. Some of it is obviously CV based. And again, it varies specialty by specialty. Sometimes they don't care at all about your CV. Sometimes your CV is really important. It depends. Does that fellowship expect you to publish, present? Does that fellowship expect you to have done a lot of things before in logbook wise, or is it understood that unless you've done a fellowship, you will never have done X, Y, or Z? Um, and so for my fellowship, it's based on CV, a letter of intent which is a really common thing in both Australian and Canadian fellowships, certainly, where you sort of have to say, this is who I am, this is what I've done, and this is where I want to go, this is who I want to be. And then there was an interview, and the interview was like nearly every other interview ever. There was some clinical stuff, some non-clinical stuff, some management, some leadership, some non-technical.
Yeah.
Um, and they mark you and they assess you, and it's like I said, it's reasonably competitive, and some of it is luck of the draw. You know, for example, my fellowship, because hand surgery is both an orthopedic and a plastic specialty. Um, my fellowship, each year they have three fellows, and they alternate. So they'll have two plastic surgeons, one orthopedic surgeon, then they'll have two orthopedic surgeons, one plastic surgeon. So it was luck of the draw that I interviewed and timed it, and I didn't know this, on a year where they decided to have two orthopedic fellows. So I had twice the chances as the year either side of me.
Yeah.
Like and again, that a big part of that comes down to speaking to previous fellows, and they'll be like, "This is how it works here." It's all about the interview, or it's all about the CV, or it's all about, depending on some countries, it's all about your references. It all comes down to who's backing you. Like the reality is nearly every fellowship will have a slightly different game to play if you want to be successful.
Now, when you then get the fellowship, what does it take to get the most out of a fellowship?
I think you need to decide what you want from it, and be really open with yourself about that. Um, there are some fellowships that famously work you hard, that they are just relentless. It is just every day, non-stop slog, and weekends, non-stop slog. There are other fellowships that are actually reasonably chilled, relative to being a registrar, being a trainee, being a resident. It can really vary, and again, that comes down to what you want. If you want to get out of your fellowship, so one of my colleagues is recently doing a fellowship in France, and it's one of the ones where you observe a great deal. And that's what he wants. But he also wants to travel around Europe because he's never traveled around Europe. And so that's part of his plan. And he's been really open about it. And he's never shied away from it. He's like, I do Monday to Friday, 8 till 6, but I have all my weekends and evenings free. And I can take leave basically whenever I want. And I want to see Europe. And so a big part of getting the most out of fellowship is knowing what you want to get out of your fellowship. Do you want to do lots of technical stuff? Do you want to do some technical stuff? Do you want to see tons, or do you want to uh, finesse your consultant level decision making, which isn't necessarily anything to do with holding a scalpel or a laryngoscope or endoscope or whatever? Um, do you want to travel? Do you want to do lots of cool, fun things in your spare time, or actually are you there to slog and go to the conferences in that space? Do you want to do loads of research, and actually do you need time to do all that research?
Yeah.
Or and so again, it's such a personal decision that you need to really know what you're getting out of it. Because if you don't know what you want and what you need, A, you'll struggle to choose a fellowship, and B, you may find yourself really disappointed. So if you want to travel around Australia and then you do a fellowship that is one of the hardcore slog, you're operating at 2 a.m. fellowships, you're going to be really upset when you're like, but I'm tired and I work all the time and I don't have any leave allowance and I'm not, and vice versa. If you are looking to do 800 cases in a year, and then you pick a fellowship that is very low volume and mostly observing or mostly assisting, for example, which is quite common, um, you'll be really disappointed. So you really need to know yourself, you need to know how you learn, and you need to know what you want, or you'll find yourself disappointed.
I have to say that feels like a great place to finish, Simon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.